Okay, I have three more questions. One, do some blood types need animal products? There's a book that's saying that there's different foods for different blood types, and that's question one. Question two, which we might have touched on in a different panel, but again, how do we keep strong bones? How do we prevent osteopenia and osteoporosis? And how about arthritis? And if our bone density tests say are good and our calcium levels are good, does that mean that we don't have to worry about vitamin D levels? So it's really a bad question about bones. And then the third question is, how many high-quality studies support the claim that you have an 80% less lifetime risk of chronic disease if you avoid tobacco, achieve a healthy weight, a healthy diet, and stay physically active? Do some blood types need animal products?
Yes, thank you. Because that's the one that makes me get apoplectic and start throwing things at the wall. All right. I'm glad we got a big group here so I can explain this. It's not going to be the last time, but at least you guys will know and you can tell everybody you know. Where did blood type come from? So people actually, the mistake that people have been led into believing is that the term blood type tells you something about your particular genetic makeup, and it doesn't. How many people in the audience have type O blood? Yeah, so do I. I don't look like most of y'all. The way the blood typing system was developed was when they started transfusing blood between humans, they would get away with it for a couple times, and then they would notice that a patient would have a catastrophic anaphylactic reaction and die. And when they did an autopsy, they found out that much or most of their blood had hemolyzed. And so that quickly made them realize, you know what, there has to be some sort of antigen or protein on the surface of some of these red blood cells that the person who received the transfusion was reacting to. So they looked for it, and guess what? They found a protein, and they named that first one A. But in continuing to examine people's blood, they found a different type of protein, and that second one they named B. But they realized that the majority of people don't have any proteins on their red blood cells, and they were going to call that 0, but they said, you know what? To remain consistent, we'll call it O. That's all that means. Whether or not you have proteins on your blood cells. And, you know, they did additional research and got the RH factor, which was a different kind of protein. But the bottom line is it just refers to whether or not your red cells carry proteins on their surface or not. Because that's the RH factor. It's a different type of protein, an antigen. Okay, but the bottom line is it doesn't have anything to do with your particular genetic makeup. And the guy who wrote the blood type book basically used this kind of logic. He said that the majority of the people who develop ulcers have type O blood, and ulcers are caused by excess acid. Acid is used to digest meat. Therefore, people with type O blood should eat diets that are high in meat. Okay, excuse my language, there are no kids present. Bullshit, 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 bullshit. Number one, human beings do not digest meat with stomach acid. We digest it.
I didn't know Adventists could say that, but it's refreshing.
I'm not supposed to. We digest it with pancreatic enzymes. We don't make enough stomach acid to actually digest meat like, say, a lion or a tiger or so forth. Secondly, we now know that most ulcers are not caused by acid overproduction, but in fact are caused by infection with H. pylori. Helicobacter pylori, it's a bacteria. So it has nothing to do with acid overproduction. And the bottom line is, since the majority of human beings on the planet have type O blood, the majority of people with any kind of disease are going to have type O blood. So the logic was completely flawed through and through. It is utterly worthless and bogus. Please, if you have that book, have a book burning party, and never, ever open it again.
Yep, that's about right. Yeah, Peter Diadamo was a nice guy, is a nice guy. Meant well, I think, but yeah, load of rubbish. So there were two other questions, one about bone health. You want to do bone health? Yeah, and the other was, how consistent is the literature showing an 80% variance in the rate of all major chronic disease if you don't smoke, eat well, and are physically active? And that question may originate from stuff that I say routinely, because I routinely note, having been obligated on numerous occasions to look at the vast expanse of relevant literature writing textbooks, this is one of the most stunningly repetitive drumbeats in all of the peer-reviewed literature. There are studies in the US, there are studies in Europe, there are studies in Australia, there are studies in men, there are studies in women. There are prospective cohort studies, retrospective cohort studies. There are short-term intervention studies in people who already have established risk factors for chronic disease. There are primary prevention studies, secondary prevention studies, studies focused preferentially on cardiovascular disease, studies focused in particular on cancer. Absolutely amazing how often, when the question is, how much can we alter the incidence, the occurrence over time of major chronic diseases, the point estimate is about 80% if you go from getting these three things wrong to getting these three things right. Exposure to tobacco, diet quality bad, changing to good, and sedentariness moving to physical activity. Now, the 80% variance, to achieve that full benefit, I reduced my risk of ever getting heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, and maybe dementia too by 80% across the board, presupposes that you're going from pretty bad at baseline to really good. If you're starting out pretty good and just a little better, obviously the net reduction in your personal risk won't be the 80%. But what the literature does is give us that view from altitude. And there's absolutely no question. Diet quality bad, exposure to tobacco, lack of physical activity, fix them. Definitively fix them. Move away from tobacco exposure altogether, optimize your diet, be routinely in motion, physically active as a matter of routine. 80% reduction in the risk of all major chronic disease and premature death. It's a stunningly consistent literature. What it would be tedious for me to do here now with nothing for you to look at is throw out specific citations. But I would tell you that if you want to start populating this with literature, you really need to remember just one study, Actual Causes of Death in the United States. That published in JAMA in 1993, and if you found that paper, Actual Causes of Death in the United States, it would then lead you to the mother lode. You would say, look for related papers, and what you'd find is unbelievably consistent affirmation of those same findings, that tobacco, poor diet, lack of physical activity collectively account for 80% of premature death and chronic disease in this country, across a vast expanse of literature. And if somebody wants a whole batch of specific citations, find me after. Be happy to share it with you.